I am so pleased to be able to introduce Ms. Charlayne Hunter-Gault, an award-winning journalist with more than 40 years in this industry, extending her work at various times to all media. She has made a success of challenging convention with her fresh insights on issues both close to home and of global impact. A trailblazer in her own right, Hunter-Gault offers audiences stories about her historic entry into the University of Georgia as its first Black woman student and the road she took through Jim Crow South to get there. She has a wealth of insight and experiences that can benefit us here at Georgia Tech. So please help me to welcome to the podium Ms. Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
We're good.
Thank you so much. My husband usually gives me the sign, but I've asked the timekeeper here to do it this time. You know, I lived for 17 years in South Africa, and one of the things I learned there, when you have so many distinguished people in the room, you say all protocols observed. So, all protocols observed, Peterson. So, having said that, hello, Georgia Tech. I didn't have to get permission this time from the Bulldogs to be here because they gave that to me a few years ago when I served on the Ivan Allen program for the Ivan Allen Prize, which is going this year, I understand, to my good friend Andrew Young. It was a rewarding time then. And all of the recipients chosen were just so inspiring. So congratulations to them and to you for making such wonderful choices. Now, I was so glad that the introduction was brief because I wanted to talk to you about one of my identities that you may not be aware of. It's identities that sometimes, if I'm not careful, get me into some conflict, particularly as a journalist, because I try not to take positions. I try not to, although I whispered a couple to someone down there, but she promised she wouldn't tell, and Omarosa wasn't here to record it, so hopefully it will not be public. So clearly, I'm a woman of color, a woman of sisters of all colors, a wife, a mother, and an American citizen. And some of those identities will surface this morning. But I want to start off today with another identity that you may not be aware of as a PK. Now, I'm looking around, and some of you in the room know what that means, and some of you don't have a clue. But anyway, it's one of the things that I shared with my late beloved and revered colleague, Gwen Eiffel. We're both PKs, preacher's kids. Now, why do I tout that identity today? Because I struggle daily with all that's going on in our country, and sometimes, actually, increasingly. I struggle and look for solace, relief, or inspiration. And so I return to lessons I learned growing up with religious parents and grandparents, lessons that served me in all kinds of difficult situations as I grew up and after I had become an adult and a professional journalist. From the mobs that surrounded me at UGA, shouting racial epithets and screaming for me to go home as I registered for classes, to war zones in Africa and tension-filled zones on the West Bank and Gaza, a few other places. Lessons that I like to say were those that outfitted me with what I like to call a suit of armor. Now, you don't see it. I have lost a few pounds, but that's another story. But this is the armor that I have worn all these years, similar to those, I believe, from what I've been told you all are crafting here for students at Georgia Tech. Now, when I look at the vitriol spewing out into the public arena these days, including on some college campuses, in order to keep myself keeping on with hope in my heart, among other things, some of the words I heard in my grandfather's church many years ago, even when in my younger years I often grew tired of his very long sermons. But also, I had a wonderful grandmother. Now, my grandfather was the preacher, but my grandmother was the saint. And in those racially charged times, my grandmother would often find me, because I used to resent having to learn those lessons. So I would climb the mango tree in the backyard of the church and the parsonage. But eventually she would find me. And so when I'm wrestling with one thing and another, I sometimes am almost surprised that I am rescued by what Jung called synchronicity. Others call coincidence, and what Squire Rushnell calls God winks. Some of you have heard of that, I'm sure. That's the instance of synchronicity that the definition of God winks sometimes mean, that something is happening that is keeping you on the right path. That's a God wink. So, since I got this invitation to speak, I've been thinking about how to wrap up in a few words the things I believe and have experienced on what I like to call, thanks to Zora Neale Hurston, my journey to the horizons. And so one of the things that has helped me along the way is to learn not what these young people here are learning at Georgia Tech. Although, just let me tell them to please keep me in mind, folks my age who are struggling even with the apps and Instagrams. Although a Harvard professor who is head of the hip hop archives recently told me that I was woke. So I'm gonna try to be woke this morning, Peterson. So, thinking of how I wanted to sum up what I wanted to talk about today, I was sitting in the ecumenical chapel on Martha's Vineyard one recent Sunday, and the words that I had been looking for to sum up what I wanted to talk about today came as the Reverend Julian A. Cook, who is an amazing young minister from Boston, who is also doing diversity work at Howard University Student Center, which is committed to promoting the words and principles of the Reverend Howard Thurman and the search for common ground. That's what they do. And the unity of all people. That's his project. And he began his sermon by reading from the first chapter of Genesis, which tells of God creating the earth that was without form and void, and darkness was upon the earth. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, I know from what I've heard about the work you're doing, because I had a long conversation with some of your people on the phone the other day, who sort of told me what to talk about. He's smiling down there. But anyway, I've told that the work you're doing and what you've just seen up here really is an ongoing endeavor to help your students make the world a better place. And that takes me to my favorite words from Esther, so appropriate to your journey at this challenging moment in our country and in our world. A world that in many places is in as much turmoil as ours. A world that used to look to us, Americans, for inspiration, but now looks in confusion, except in the dictators who have taken to using the word fake news. And to be sure, I worry about what's happening to that single garment of destiny that Martin Luther King referred to when speaking of our mutuality of interest with the rest of the world, and whether that single garment of destiny is frayed now beyond repair. The words that again come to mind from my grandmother's teachings are the words found in the Bible, Esther. For in Esther it says, "For if you remain silent about this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Now don't worry, I'm not going to give a sermon. Maybe not. And I'm certainly not royalty. But I am going to speak this morning as a servant and not an enemy of the people. Servants, as are most of my colleagues in the media, some like April Ryan, a sister who's now under physical threat and has to have hired someone to protect her against the threats that she's getting. She and so many other journalists are under physical threat, but they continue to do their jobs, reporting the news and the truth without fear or favor. I have to say, this worries me no end. That is why your mission today is as important, if not more important than ever for such a time as this. Not least through the unique tools you are using in not remaining silent and preparing your students to embrace the better angels of their nature. There are lessons in our history, American history, as well as the specific African American history that help us learn from history. And on my journey to the horizons, I have always found it inspirational and instructive to look back at our history. For it is in that history that I find what I need to stay hopeful and positive, communicating with people of every political stripe and in other parts of the world. Important, I think, especially for such a time as this. This despite the fact that I had a journalism professor at UGA who once said, somewhat enigmatically, that we learn from history that we do not learn from history. But once again, in another message at Union Chapel, the minister quoted the post-Civil War African American freedom song, "Oh Freedom." And he said, and he quoted it, and he said, "And before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave." So no, Kanye, slavery was not a choice. And one of the things that has helped me on my life's journey was the history I was taught early on. History that I lived as I walked through the doors of a school here in Atlanta named Henry McNeil Turner. When learning about him, as we had to do and were reminded every day as we walked through the door, named for him, excuse me, Booker T. Washington High School students, I'm sure you had to do the same thing. But at any rate, when learning about him and his journey, we were taught about the promises of the Constitution and the role of good citizens to remain vigilant about keeping those promises. We also learned from Dr. King that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Justice I witnessed right here in Atlanta. But I have also observed over the years that sometimes what goes around comes around. And years later, when I was moderating a panel with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Madeleine Albright, in which the Arch, in his own gentle way, was criticizing something about our democracy that he felt had not lived up to its promise. I can't remember exactly what it was, and I called the Ford Foundation the other day and said, "Do you all remember?" And they didn't remember, but what they did remember was that when the Arch said that democracy wasn't living up to its promise, Madeleine Albright's response was, "Listen, honey, democracy is messy." And yes, look how long it took even for someone who didn't believe in slavery to abolish it. And even then, thanks to our system of government, improvements were made along the way as late as 1965. But one of the things that stands out for me is those who have made strides along the moral arc have shown a capacity to forgive. As when Abraham Lincoln directed his remarks to the southern states that had seceded from the Union, creating the Confederate States of America. The words Lincoln spoke are not that different from those of Mandela, who, when he was making demands to the warders on Robben Island on behalf of his fellow prisoners and himself, from his prison cell, he managed to end in the same letter a positive vision of an inclusive future he and his fellow prisoners were fighting for and doing life in prison for. Now, to Lincoln first. Here's what Lincoln said, speaking to those Confederates, saying, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as they surely will be, by the better angels of our nature." Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as you would know, led to the freedom of only about 500,000 slaves, but every other slave, 3.4 million, were freed by the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. I know I look old, but I wasn't there then. But taking a giant leap forward, back to Mandela, after enumerating his demands as only he could, given the legal training he had, he spoke to the warders in this way. He said, "But even when the clash," and remember this was apartheid, and it was horrendous, "but even when the clash between you and me has taken the most extreme form, I should like us to fight over principles and ideas and without personal hatred, so that at the end of the battle, whatever the results might be, I can proudly shake hands with you, because I feel I have fought an upright and worthy opponent who has observed the whole code of honor and decency." Honor and decency. And when he was finally released in 1990, Nelson Mandela called for restorative justice rather than retribution. Lessons from those days that are timeless, and certainly for such a time as this. For even in these times, a Democratic president, Barack Obama, honored a Republican, John McCain, with whom he fought over issues, but saying at his memorial service, to know John was to know that as quick and as his passions might flare, he was just as quick to forgive and ask for forgiveness. He knew more than most his own flaws and his blind spots, and he knew how to laugh at himself. And that self-awareness made him all the more compelling. Those are the words of Barack Obama at the funeral for John McCain. Words for such a time as this, when we have so much division rooted in race and appropriately called racism. Now, when younger people say that they've never seen it so bad, I think about how old their memory is. But even former President Jimmy Carter, who is 93 years old and has seen a lot, including working with us here at receiving one of our awards, he lived through a lot in his native South, but he said recently, quote, "The problem now with racial divide is probably greater than I have known in my adult lifetime." He's 93 years old, so that's a long time. And yet, in my own lifetime, 76 years, I have seen people of goodwill of all races, separately and together, confront forces that sought to divide us and emerge victorious. Charlottesville is not the first time white supremacists have reared their ugly heads. And I think the loud, vitriolic cacophony today often attempts to make us forget the times when the forces of good triumphed over the forces of evil. And yet, as the song goes, there's always something there to remind me. Like a note I got from a friend just this past week after we had participated in a taping about motherhood. And she wrote to me, "My great uncle is Dr. Robert Haling of Tallahassee in St. Augustine, Florida, a dentist whose family was terrorized by the Klan and whose fingers were broken so that he could no longer practice dentistry. Throughout it all, he never cowered to their intimidation. She said, we're all delivered from strong stock, and our children and grandchildren inherit our legacy." Moreover, just recently, I watched the first part of a multi-part documentary called Bobby Kennedy for President. And I was reminded, as if I needed any reminding, of another time when white nationalists demonstrated against the law of the land, spewing racist taunts and attempting to support the Alabama governor, who, in keeping his vow of segregation now and segregation forever, had tried to block the entry of 2 black students, Vivian Malone, may she rest in peace, her birthday was recently, and James Hood. And I was reminded of how an administration, JFK's, that had initially been reluctant to support the Freedom Riders and other direct action protests of the civil rights movement for fear of alienating his white Southern supporters. But he stepped up, his administration stepped up, and forced the governor out of the door and into a shameful chapter of our history. Now, let me hasten to say that in those days, and for many years after that, the words diverse and inclusive were not a part of the lexicon. Freedom, justice, and equality were the words that propelled our case at UGA, and also the words I heard most from my friends miles away here in Atlanta, standing up and sometimes being thrown to the ground or into cold jail cells right down here in Atlanta, Georgia, with convicted murderers. Carolyn Longbank still lives here. She served on something in the government. What do you call that? What she was on something in Atlanta that made laws and made sure everybody was living up to what they were supposed to live up to. The city council is what I'm trying to remember. Thank you. Anyway, she served, along with so many others, in jail with convicted murderers. And many others went to graveyards in other places, aiming with all their hearts, souls, and minds, and bodies to stand up, refusing to allow those in charge to keep on with separate but equal. That was anything but. And in the process of attending classes at UGA, where I sat with students who made no secret of their happiness with my presence, or meeting up from time to time with my high school classmate, Hamilton Hamp Holmes, the only other black student at UGA, who was denied the opportunity to play football, as he had been a star quarterback at Henry McNeil Turner, beating Booker T. Washington all the time. Anyway, had to throw that in. That's not in the speech, but I remember that. Anyway, Hamp was told by the administrators when he said he wanted to play football that either his teammates or those from all the other white schools that they might be playing in the South, which were not desegregated, might try to hurt him. Hamp never made a single friend the entire time. But sometime in watching my friends and those who joined them from all over the South and from other parts of the country, I witnessed the composition of the civil rights movement by what many years later would be called diverse and inclusive, which is one of the reasons I object when I hear a condemnation of any group as a whole, such as generalizing about white people. And I quickly point out that white people were part of our civil rights movement, and some like Goodman and Cheney and Swerner and Viola Liuzzo and many others died for us in that struggle. Now, in my identity as a citizen, while I am deeply concerned about the kinds of steps being taken that will erase many of the gains made during our time, not least the prospect of reversing the 1954 Supreme Court decision that paved the way for me and so many others to attend the schools of our choice. That is happening, people. It's happening. And I'm speaking now not as a journalist, but as a journalist who reads the news, but I'm also speaking as a citizen who doesn't want to see the gains that we have made reversed out of some political expediency. At any rate, I still look back and see how we got over. And we got over. To be sure, it took determination and the kinds of sacrifices I've been talking about. And sometimes it took time, but in the end, victory was ours. Lessons for such a time as this. Again, what I'd like to call my armor for such a time as this. But here's the shameful thing. The kind of strength and inspiration I and so many of us got from our history is not being taught in our schools today, in many of our schools. Not long ago, I spoke at a high school in Florida, and I started to talk about graduation. And I said, so when are you all graduating? And they said, May 17th. And I excitedly exclaimed, my, what a historic day to be graduating on. And I got a lot of blank stares. And then I worried about why I was getting so many blank stares. And I realized that nobody in that room, none of the young people had any idea about May 17th. And so when I did that at UGA not too long ago to some high school students, I told them to go and look it up because this was indeed a historic day. And I gave them my overloaded email address, which I rarely do. I gave it to you because I want to hear from you. That's your speaker at lunch today. But I said, look it up and write me. And I got 2 letters, beautiful letters, one from a black girl and one from a white boy, both of whom said, thank you for telling us this. And so when I was in Florida giving this same story, I actually told them. But the young black teacher who had invited me and escorted me around the Florida school that day told me as she walked me to the car, she had a confession to make. This is a young woman, probably in her early 30s. And she said that growing up in Mississippi, they celebrated May Day, but she never knew why. She had never been taught the significance of it. Now, it seems to me, and I'm not probably telling you something you don't already know, but it seems to me that we could narrow our divides by students of all colors having a better understanding of the struggle so many have endured in the long walk to freedom, and learn how to communicate to those who've not been fortunate enough to have learned about it at home or at school. Now, while I've spent a bit of time on some of the things in the past that propelled me positively forward on my journey, let me hasten to tell you where I get inspiration in the present. For the last 3 years, I've been doing a series for the PBS NewsHour called Race Matters. And I have talked with dozens of people who have solutions to racism, including my most recent one, Peterson, on implicit bias. I did that in New York City with the New York Police Department. They could really use it. But one of those people I talked to was the Reverend Barber, who just spoke about his work at Aretha Franklin's service. Now, I know most of you in this room probably watched every second of it, as I did, and who, along with his white colleague, Reverend Barber's, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, he quoted, described for me in my series the solutions he has put in place in the last few years, primarily speaking to whites, especially poor whites, about what they have in common with blacks like them, saying, quote, you talk to people honestly. You talk to them about what it means to be a human being, and you show them the hypocrisy, you know. You show them how they're being fooled, if you will, that people are saying, I care about your best interest, but those people are actually putting in place policies that are hurting everybody. This is Reverend Barber. His colleague, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, spoke honestly and earnestly about how he had been a racist, worked even for Strom Thurmond, but didn't know he was a racist until he listened to Reverend Barber one day where he spoke at an event that had nothing otherwise to do with race, and it had been called by the North Carolina governor. And Wilson Hartgrove, who'd been with Barber ever since, said this. He said, what can be learned from our experience is that white people need, now he's generalizing too, but I accepted that from him, that white people need to talk about race honestly. We need to say, of course we're racist. This is a country that's built on white supremacy. You know, it's not like a personal failing, he said. I inherited this. Racism is about structures that pass on what we inherited, right? He asked. Inequalities, he goes on, that we inherited are being written into these structures. And when we help white people think about that, I think we're making it possible to form alliances that we haven't been able to form. In another of my Race Matters conversations, Northeastern University professor Linda Trump talked about the need for perseverance when people have tried and failed to break down barriers. And she said, it's like trying to learn to play tennis. You don't know how to hold the racket, right? Or when you're first learning a language, you're not automatically fluent. These skills take time to cultivate. And as a tennis player, I knew what she was talking about. She said, that's hard too. But that's what's exciting and promising to me is that there have been many others with solutions in some unlikely places. Like the comedy Blackish. Some of you watch Blackish? I spoke with one of its stars, Tracee Ellis Ross, the day after the Golden Me Too Globes. And I asked her why the program believes that these heady issues like racism can be addressed through comedy. And this is what her response was. She says, when one's heart is open through laughter, so much more information can be received. And she went on to say, I think it's like giving people their medicine with a spoonful of sugar, you know, or giving your dog its antibiotics and peanut butter. Now, two more quick ones that are among my favorites, although I have to say they are all actually my favorites. One was Kevin Murphy, a former police chief in Montgomery, Alabama. He was chief during the Civil Rights era and Bloody Sunday, the March from Selma. And when he became chief, this is what he told me he did. He said, one of the first things I implemented as the new police chief was enacting a class, creating a class. We went back in history to the Dred Scott decision and all the way through to the Emmett Till case, he said, because I wanted the officers to experience what really happened. And he went on to say, you know, what my observation is you have a 21-year-old officer who had never lived through or seen the civil rights era for what it was, the dark reality of it. And so this young officer would stop an African-American citizen and get somewhat of a pushback because maybe this 60 or 75-year-old African-American citizen's last encounter with a Montgomery police officer was very negative. But he went on to say, the young policeman attended the class, and he said, I saw a lot of promise in that. The next time they encountered that citizen, they felt like, I understand now. But one of the latest ones I've done, which has yet to run, breaking news, everybody. Don't tell my producers I said this. But it was about a project started by a young Muslim who heard Nelson Mandela speak about the role of interfaith movements in getting him out of prison and then helping to end apartheid in South Africa after he got out. And it sparked something that led him to come home to America and start an interfaith youth movement among other college students. And recently, he held a conference in Chicago. I was so impressed by the work that he did. I just had surgery 3 days before, but I traveled to Chicago and found over 500 students of all races, religions, and backgrounds. Even the Muslim students at lunchtime went into a separate room and had their prayers, and it was just so amazing to see. Now, he didn't paper over the hostility and division on some college campuses today, and he said this, so we've got this really thorny set of problems, and I think that one of the ways that we address it is with the kind of interfaith partnerships that create spaces where it's easier for people to cooperate. He said that doesn't mean we're going to agree on every election. That doesn't mean we're going to agree on economic policy, but we can start a baseball league together. We can help make the school play successful. There are all kinds of things that are central to our civil society and civic culture in the United States, that he says, that I feel are now being shredded because of a poisonous political environment. He said that, I didn't say it. If, he said, we're not willing to do the work of citizens with other citizens, you can't have a healthy, diverse democracy. And when I asked him if he was optimistic, given all that he had said about the poisonous political environment, he said, I'm on 25 college campuses a year. I probably visited something like 130 in the past 8 or 10 years. It's not like things don't ever get tense, he said. But what I read about the news on college campuses is foreign to me. He should have heard your presentation. He said, which is to say, it is by definition sensational. And he went on to say, I feel like if I wasn't optimistic, I would be being ungrateful to the work that Martin Luther King Jr. did to bring me to this country. Remember, I said he's a Muslim, he came from India. And the beautiful thing, he said, is there's lots of us who feel that way. He should be here today. There's this whole growing network, he said, of college student interfaith leaders on American campuses basically saying, where there's the divide, let me bridge it. He said, that's the future of America, or we have no future at all. And online, I talked to him about his new book, Out of Many Faiths, in which he expressed confidence in this current college generation, like those you're dealing with here at Georgia Tech. And I will paraphrase his words about the belief that the ugliness of our times is not going to win, not least because of efforts like yours here that will inspire young people to be good citizens, realizing that they have the power to embrace, repair where necessary, and perpetuate what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. I thank you for all the work that you're doing here, for your kind attention this morning, and your willingness and commitment to shine the light, creating the next.
on behalf of a very grateful audience and university. You're all that you were billed to be and more, and so we're really honored that you're here today. She has agreed to take some questions from the floor for about 8 minutes, something like that. I have to check. And I would like to open the floor for questions, and you can feel confused.
Sure, thank
so,
you.
First one is the courage one. Here, would you come down, please?
Thank you very, very much. My name's Ellen Dunham-Jones. I'm a professor of urban design in the College of Design. I was really struck by your comments on the evolution of the struggle for civil rights in the language of describing it more in terms of a fight for freedom and equality, and the shift to now the language of diversity and inclusion. And I'd love to just hear you elaborate a little bit more on what do you feel has been gained and or lost in some of that shift?
Well, thank you for the question, because I'm hoping that diversity and inclusion includes lessons of freedom, justice, and equality. I think that when we talked about freedom and justice and equality, it was a time, particularly in the South, that we didn't have freedom, we rarely had justice, and we did not have equality. Now, as I said earlier, what goes around comes around, because I've just read in either today or yesterday's New York Times about the new school superintendent in New York City, one of the most progressive cities in the country, where the segregation is keeping young black students behind, and they're being separated even in schools of choice, where you have charter schools, I guess. And so he's going to try to do something about it. So I think that when we look around the country, and I used to say a long time ago, because I used to visit the North when I was a young girl in New York City, and coming from, Covington, Georgia, and Atlanta, and I saw as much segregation up there as I did in South, so I called it down South and up South. And so we still have some of those same problems. I mean, look at our prisoners and how they don't get their freedom if they are African Americans or people of color at the same rate as others. So that's freedom. I look at justice, same thing, disparities in sentencing. I looked at equality, same thing. So what goes around comes around. So our diversity and inclusion must include those terms: freedom, justice, and equality. You could even say diversity and inclusion, freedom, justice, and equality. That may not fit on the front of your program, but it certainly would be an inclusive way of dealing with what we are all dealing with. I'm making certain assumptions, but you're here, so what we're all dealing with today. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. My name is Amanda Pelerin. Sorry.
Just got hit.
My name is Amanda Pelerin. I'm an archivist here at the Georgia Tech Library. So
can I borrow those earrings? Sometimes they match my
hair. Would you like them now? So I teamed up with archivists at Georgia State University and the University of Georgia to give a presentation on desegregation across those three institutions.
On what?
On desegregation.
Oh,
So, of course, you were a central part of that story. But what we were all struck by and really saddened by was how we couldn't find documents from the students' perspectives in our repositories, our archival.
At that time, you mean?
Yes, or even now. So my question is, how can we go about recovering documents that show stories from the persons that are most central to those narratives so that we can make sure we are capturing your perspective?
Great. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your efforts. Well, I've turned over all of my papers that I could find, and I'm continuing to find some from UGA. And I guess it was a couple of years ago that I did an oral history at the library there with 3 students who followed Hamilton and me about their experiences there. And it was interesting because just as with Hamp and I, we both had different ways of dealing with all of this. Hamp, when he couldn't play football and he didn't have any friends on campus, he'd go home to the black family where he lived, because girls had to live on campus. We were Magnolias. We had to be protected. But the boys could live anywhere, so he lived with the black family. And he'd leave school and go play football with the boys in the hood. And that made him very happy. So each of these 3 young, not so young students who have really succeeded. One of them could have been in that movie, what was the name of the movie about the women who were Hidden Figures. She was a hidden figure and had the same experience that is chronicled in that movie. It's almost a true story. She told her story. The other young woman who lived in Athens told her story. The one who became an engineer lived in the same room that I did, because for years they didn't let the black women stay in the second floor rooms with the white girls. And so she stayed in the room that I inhabited for those years that I was there. But she had a different experience, the one who lived in Athens. And then the young man had a very different experience. He made friends. And so that is in the archives at the university. But I think it's be a great idea and a great project to try and locate some of those who are a lot younger than I am and actually get them to do either some oral history or some narratives. But also, I hear from a lot of the young, not a lot, but a few of the young black students who are now at University of Georgia. They're from everywhere. They're from Haiti. In fact, I had the star football player from Haiti with the Bulldogs, who is from Haiti, and it was shortly after there had been some negative comments about Haiti and Africa. And in my role as a journalist, I couldn't single those out, but I said, we have someone here from Haiti, which is one of the first countries to liberate from America and has gone on to become a great country, although they've suffered in the last few years, but I had him stand. So it would be great to get some narratives from the students now. One African-American student just became the first black head of the president of the student body. And you have young African Americans and other people of color participating in every level layer of UGA, including the red and black. I used to go when I first got to Georgia, and I wanted to be a journalist. And I would go to the red and black, the student newspaper, and I would just sit there for days and not get an assignment not because the editor didn't want. Tom Johnson eventually became head of CNN and is one of the great graduates of the school. He was eager for me to be there, but a lot of the things that the students were involved in took place off campus, and Athens was still segregated. So what I did in order to get some experience, I would come home to Atlanta and work with an upstart newspaper called the Atlanta Enquirer, which had started because the white Journal and Constitution, and even the Atlanta Daily World, which was very conservative because it had white advertisers it didn't want to antagonize. So none of them really covered the movement. And so I went and worked with Carl Holman and Julian Bond, learning how to report on the students. They would get arrested in the morning, bailed out in the afternoon, and come and talk to us about their experiences, and I would write those up. So those are still around, and I think it would be useful to look at some of them. I eventually graduated not just to covering those, but looking at Brady Hospital, which in those days was probably one of the only hospitals black people could really go to, but there was a lot of violence at the time, and so I went and wrote about the congested emergency rooms, and that's where I really learned to take what was on the ground and put it in print. And so I think that if you started to locate graduates going back to '63, I'm sure many of them are still around. Herschel Walker is somewhere here in Georgia. he eventually got to play and be a star on the team. I'm sure they'd have some interest. And that would be, you know, my husband and I started a fund at UGA, and if you all want to contribute, we'd be happy to have your checks. But we started a fund called Giving Voice to the Voiceless. And somehow in the back of my head, as I listen to your question, I'm thinking we might be able to give a little bit of money to somebody who would be interested in going around and collecting some of those stories. So you write to them, not me, but I'll support it.
One last question.
Good morning, Rashad Owens from Georgia Tech Strategic Consulting. Thank you for being here. My question is about symbols. As I look at the picture behind us here, you're standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Oh, you noticed that?
Oh, I noticed that. It's the same
People
place.
want me to change my picture, and I said never. I'm a little older, but still.
Yes, I understand it because that symbol means so much. It's the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who freed the slaves, right? It's the same place that I picked that I wanted to propose to my then girlfriend, who is now my wife. Ooh. So that means so much, right? That symbol. But look at Nike in today's time. They have become a symbol, either on one side of the aisle or the other aisle, in signing Colin Kaepernick, who took a kneel during the NFL, and they signed him now to be the face of the company for their 30th year anniversary of Just Do It, right? How do we at Georgia Tech become a symbol, right? Symbols like the Lincoln Memorial, symbol like Nike. How can we really be emboldened to push the conversation of justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion? A symbol.
Great statement. And you're here. So that might be one answer. Another answer I thought about as I watched the Twitter feeds about Colin Kaepernick was how, if I were an editor and not a journalist, and I could edit tweets, I would have said, if I were the leader of this country, I thought about it, and I would have said, even if I disagreed with Colin Kaepernick, I would have said in my tweet, and any of you who want to vote for me for President of the United States, let me know, and if I have a critical mass, I might run at some point. But anyway, I would have said, I respect the rights of every American citizen to exercise his or her rights, even when I disagree. But I respect those decisions. That's what I would have said. And on the Nike ad, I would have just put my foot out and took a picture wearing my Nike.
Thank you. Thank you.